Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to sift through complex information and pull out the key insights for you. Today, we're tackling a topic many of us think we get, but, well, it turns out to be way more nuanced: the idea of race and its scientific basis.
That's right. And we're leaning heavily on a really fascinating paper from 1990 by Marvin Zuckerman. It's called Some Dubious Premises in Research and Theory on Racial Differences. And it really does challenge some long-held ideas, raises big questions about the science, especially when trying to pin differences purely on biology or evolution.
Okay, right, let's get into it. So our mission today is to explore what modern science, especially, psychology and genetics, really says about race. We'll look at definitions, evidence from personality, genetics, even touch on tricky areas like crime statistics in this context.
And crucially, the ethical side, too. What responsibilities do scientists have here?
Exactly. Get ready for maybe a few aha moments, because what you think you know, it might get a little shaken up. So, first things first. We all have this gut feeling about race, right? Usually based on how people look. But how does that everyday idea actually stack up against scientific definitions, say, from modern anthropology?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? The gap between the sort of layperson view, often based on stereotypes, let's be honest, and what biologists or anthropologists say now. I mean, pretty much everyone agrees there's only one human species, Homo sapiens. Evolved, around 200,000 years ago?
Right.
East Africa?
Right, one species. That's fundamental.
Yeah.
So if we're all Homo sapiens, where does all the visible variation come from?
Well, these variations people use to distinguish groups. They're actually quite recent, evolutionarily speaking. Mostly see it as, adaptations to climate. Or sometimes just quirks from small, isolated groups breeding together. That old idea that some races climbed higher up an evolutionary ladder, like Negroid to Caucasoid to Mongoloid, that's really just speculation. It's not verifiable, and it actually goes against some evolutionary theory.
Okay, so those surface differences, skin color, hair texture, maybe head shape, the things people historically pointed to, they aren't deep evolutionary divides.
That's precisely the problem.
Yeah.
These features, well, they don't always bundle together neatly, and no single feature is a foolproof guide. Think about skin color. It varies massively within any group you might label a race. In Africa alone, you see everything from very dark skin to yellowish tan. And interestingly, some groups traditionally called Caucasoid are actually darker than some African groups traditionally called Negroid. Same diversity in Europe.
Wow. So it's definitely not a black and white issue, literally or figuratively. It sounds like race becomes more about maybe legal definitions or cultural interpretations than hard biology.
Absolutely. The paper gives some striking examples. Like in America, before the Civil War, the law said if you had even 1/32nd black ancestry, the one-drop rule ID, you were black. Didn't matter how you look. Then you look at Brazil, and it's almost the opposite. Any degree of Caucasian appearance, and you're seen as white.
That's a huge difference in definition.
It is. And even trying something more scientific like blood types, it doesn't clear things up. Yes, there are different frequencies of blood types in different populations, but all the major blood types were found pretty much everywhere in all groups. And the common frequencies don't always line up with those classic physical racial features people talk about. It really, really challenges those old ideas of race based just on how people look, the phenotype. Okay, so physical traits, blood types, they don't give us these neat, clear-cut racial boxes. What about digging a bit deeper? Things like temperament or personality. Do we see clear racial patterns there?
That's another critical point the paper makes. When you look at temperament or personality, the variation within any so-called racial group is actually much, much larger than the average difference between groups. Think about it this way. In Africa, you have groups like the Pygmies and the Watusi with significant differences in height, right?
But that physical difference is probably minor compared to the huge range of temperaments you'd find within either of those groups. You can even find groups with very similar genetics who are culturally and temperamentally just worlds apart.
That's a really important perspective. So when studies do come out claiming they found racial differences in psychological traits, what might be going wrong there? Or what are they missing?
Often it boils down to sampling. That's a huge issue. The paper points out, for instance, if you just compare infants from different African tribes, Kuyu, Digo, Maasai, so you find significant temperament differences between those tribes. So that makes it really, really tricky to then take a limited sample of, say, black individuals in the U.S. or the U.K. whose specific mix of African and maybe European ancestry is often unknown and generalize about black temperament.
Right. The sample might not represent the whole picture at all, which leads us to this really interesting study you mentioned, Barrett and Eysenck, 1984. across 25 countries.
Yes, exactly. The paper calls it a masterpiece of cross-cultural research, and for good reason. They looked at personality, specifically using scales like Ising psychoticism or P-scale,
And the P-scale measures.
things like impulsivity, uh, lack of socialization, sensation-seeking, aggression, traits that some older, frankly, dubious theories had tried to link to race, hypothesizing, highest in Negroid, lowest in Mongoloid groups.
Okay, so what did this huge study actually find?
The results completely blew those hypotheses out of the water. It was really eye-opening.
Give us some examples.
Okay, so for instance, India, which was categorized as white in this study's framework, actually scored highest on the P-scale for both men and women.
Highest, okay, wow.
Yeah. And among men, Australia, also predominantly white, and Hong Kong, supposedly restrained Mongoloid, were also very high on P. Then at the low end for men, you had white samples from Israel and Spain, and Nigeria, one of the black African countries in the study.
So Nigeria was low on the scale.
For men, yes. Ugandan men, the other black sample, were kind of in the middle range. And for women, Ugandan women were actually among the top 3 highest scorers, right up there with women from India and Yugoslavia, both classified as Caucasoid.
So it sounds like black and white groups could be found at both the high and low ends of this scale. There's no clear racial pattern.
Exactly. That's precisely the conclusion. The paper states it pretty bluntly. Race seems to be irrelevant to the dimension. When they looked at the overall pattern of personality across all 25 countries, comparing profiles, there was just no grouping by race. None.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, China and Japan, both Asian countries, were almost polar opposites on the similarity scale.
Yeah.
About as different as you could get. Meanwhile, Israelis and Nigerians, classified as white and black, actually turned out to be quite similar in their overall personality patterns.
That completely upends the idea of distinct racial personality types, doesn't it?
It really does. And if you link this back to what we know about human genetics now, it makes perfect sense. Genetic analyses, looking at proteins, DNA sequencing, they all point to the same thing. Most human genetic diversity isn't between races. Something like 84% of all human genetic variation is found between individuals within the same local population or tribe or nation.
84% within the same group.
Yep. Only about 10% is accounted for by these broad racial groupings people use, and maybe 6% by geographical region. So the genetics strongly support the idea that these racial groups are far more alike than they are different.
Okay, that's a powerful point from the genetics. But let's shift to a more socially charged area. What about things like crime rates or antisocial behavior? These often get linked to race in public discussion. Does the science support any kind of inherited racial pattern here?
Yeah, this is a really important area to discuss carefully. Because yes, crime rates, especially for black males in certain environments like inner-city ghettos, have definitely been used by some to argue for inherited racial patterns. But the actual research on criminality, it paints a much more complicated picture. For example, twin studies suggest adult crime might have some genetic link, some heritability. But interestingly, juvenile delinquency shows very little.
Oh, that's interesting. So being delinquent as a teen doesn't strongly predict adult criminality from a genetic standpoint.
Apparently not as strongly as one might think. And crucially, most teenagers who get into trouble don't actually become adult criminals.
Okay. What about other kinds of studies?
Well, adoption studies often provide stronger evidence for genetic influence. For example, if a child's biological parents had criminal records, that child had a higher chance of criminality, even when raised by adoptive parents without criminal records.
Right. That suggests a genetic link.
It does. But, and this is a really big bug, highlighted in the paper, the socioeconomic status, the class of the adopted family, also had a significant impact on whether the adopted child engaged in crime.
Ah, so environment plays a huge role, even when there might be some genetic predisposition.
Exactly. It really highlights how powerful environmental factors are.
So we have to be super careful about just jumping to biological explanations for complex social things like crime?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The paper argues strongly that if you ignore the clear impact of things like, poverty, drug availability, family disruption, especially in some lower-income black communities, you're missing huge environmental drivers. And here's a really key finding. A major study by the National Institute of Mental Health, a big one, they did random sampling thousands of black and white individuals across 3 different U.S. cities. And they looked for diagnoses of antisocial personality disorder.
Okay, and what did they find regarding race?
Get this. No significant racial differences.
No difference at all.
Not statistically significant. In fact, in 2 of the 3 cities, the rates were actually slightly higher for whites, though again, probably not significantly.
Wow. So even if official crime rates differ between groups, that doesn't mean the underlying rate of diagnosed antisocial personality differs, at least not when you use proper random sampling.
That's exactly the point. It suggests that the higher crime rates seen in some groups might be much more strongly linked to those environmental factors, poverty, lack of opportunity, etc., things that can lead to delinquency rather than an inherent difference in personality disorder. In fact, the research suggests adult criminality in Black individuals might be more related to their socioeconomic background than it is for white individuals. And other studies found no genetic differences in sociopathy between Blacks and whites.
This whole deep dive really makes you think differently about race, but the paper goes beyond just the science, right? It talks about the responsibilities scientists have when they study such loaded topics. What does it even mean for science itself to be racist? And what are the dangers?
Yeah, the paper tackles this head-on. It defines scientific racism pretty clearly. It's basically assuming that psychological or cultural traits are biologically determined by race, believing races differ significantly in these traits, and usually believing your own race is superior. It notes that some researchers might pursue this kind of work, maybe even claiming it's purely scientific and denying any political agenda. But the problem is, the public often doesn't make that distinction. People don't always separate scientific theory from political consequences or population stats from how they apply to individuals. They might hear inherited and just think fixed, unchangeable.
Right. So there's a real risk that even if a scientist claims objectivity, their work can be easily misinterpreted or worse, used to justify prejudice in society.
It's a huge risk, a critical point. And while the general scientific ideal is, freedom of inquiry if a question can be investigated, the paper asks a tough question. Is research trying to find inherent racial differences really important scientific work, especially given its potential to cause harm by reinforcing stereotypes that fuel racism? The author even makes a stark comparison to the immoral studies done by Nazi scientists, saying the methodology doesn't excuse the harm.
That's a strong statement. So it's not necessarily about censoring research topics.
No, the paper argues censorship can even be counterproductive. It can make people defend flawed research uncritically just because it's being attacked.
Okay, so if not censorship, then what?
Responsibility. Profound responsibility. Scientists working in these areas have to strive for absolute objectivity, no selective data, rigorous sampling, critically evaluating their own methods, always considering alternative explanations. This is why critical peer review is just non-negotiable, especially here.
And how they communicate the findings, that seems crucial too.
Absolutely. The paper suggests the proper way is publish in peer-reviewed journals first, see how scientific colleagues react, then maybe talk to the public, and do so carefully, not jumping straight onto talk shows where complex findings get oversimplified. Because let's face it, the public often takes what someone in the lab coat says as gospel truth. Scientists need to be incredibly cautious, qualifying their conclusions.
So ultimately, the quality of the science itself is absolutely paramount.
It is. The paper stresses this. Is the research based on good science, good scholarship, sound logic? That question is never irrelevant. While we defend academic freedom, scientists also have a duty to speak up, to clearly state disagreements with what the paper calls practitioners of racist science, and explain why their work is flawed. If good scientists stay silent, then flawed, harmful ideas might just get accepted as truth by the public. And the harm done by bad science that props up dangerous ideologies like racism, well, it's a terrible disservice, not just to science, but to all of us, to the whole human community.
Wow. This deep dive has really shown, I think, just how shaky the concept of race is when you put it under a scientific microscope. So many common assumptions, or even things presented in some studies, turn out to be, well, like the paper says, based on dubious premises. We've seen again and again that the variation within any so-called racial group is just so much bigger than the average differences between them. Physical traits, personality, even our basic genetics.
And how vital it is to look at environmental social factors when we're trying to understand complex human behaviors, instead of just jumping to biology or genetics as the sole explanation. This material really makes it clear. Yes, individuals differ, and that's worth studying, but sweeping generalizations about racial traits, often built on shaky ground, flawed methods, poor sampling.
So thinking about all this, what's the takeaway for you listening right now in a world grappling with diversity, understanding, prejudice?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? If science increasingly tells us that we humans are fundamentally much more alike than we are different, how do we actually use that knowledge? How can understanding this help us push back against stereotypes? Maybe foster more empathy, think more critically when we hear claims about group differences? What might really shift in our societies if this scientific understanding truly became common knowledge, not just something discussed in papers like Zuckerman? Something to think about.